Well, good morning everyone and welcome to this event, Charging Up, Maturing the Market for EVs in Britain and across the world, hosted in partnership with Auto Trader. My name is Patrick Hall, I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue. Ben Webster was originally going to be chairing today's discussion, but due to unforeseen circumstances he's no longer able to be with us, so I will be filling in as chair. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. If you want to connect to the Wi-Fi, it's called the Studio and the password is customer first, all one word, lowercase. If you would like to tweet about this event, please do so using the hashtags BrightBlue and COP26. You can also tag BrightBlue. Our Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue and Auto Trader's Twitter handle is @AutoTrader. We do have roaming mics, so if any of you want to ask a question, I'd ask that you refrain from asking until the microphone is handed to you. It won't give any sound in the room. We're just using the mics because obviously we've got a virtual audience as well, so just providing them with a bit of context in terms of your question before the panel answers it, so that would be great. For our virtual audience attending through the camera, you can ask questions via Slido. These will then be texted to me. So if you see me using my phone, I'm not being terribly rude. I'm just looking at the questions that have been given to me. So it's a very timely discussion. Transport is the largest emitting sector in the UK. Cars are responsible for the bulk of this. Bright Blue's done quite a bit of work around decarbonising transport. Earlier this year we released our report Driving Uptake, which made a number of recommendations for increasing EV uptake. For instance, we called for the introduction of a second-hand EV grant for low-income households. We've campaigned for the introduction of for the extension of enhanced capital allowances for the renting and leasing sector, and we've called for interoperability to be a condition of central government funding for charge points, and many more. But we'll get into it. In terms of the key questions that we're asking today, we're asking 7. The first is, which countries have seen the biggest increases in the number of EVs and why? Which fiscal and regulatory policies work in boosting the take-up of EVs? What policies or measures are needed to make electric vehicles more affordable for less well-off households? What policies are needed to support vehicle manufacturers and industry to cease all sales of new petrol and diesel cars by the next decade? When can price parity between new electric vehicles and petrol and diesel vehicles be expected? How can electric vehicle charging infrastructure best be improved? And finally, how can government and industry help consumers to make low-carbon choices around transport? So we have a great panel lineup here answering these questions today. I'm joined by Hugh Merriman. Hugh is the Member of Parliament for Bexhill and Battle and the Chair of the Transport Select Committee. Prior to his parliamentary career, Hugh was a barrister and local councillor. I'm joined by Graham Simpson, who is the Shadow Transport Minister and the member of the Cross-Party Group for Aviation, Housing and Cycling, Walking and Buses. Additionally, Graham is a member of the Delegated Powers Committee for the Scottish Conservative Party. I'm joined by Annalisa Bevin. Annalisa is the Zero Emission Infrastructure Specialist at the California Air Resources Board, ensuring that California has the necessary infrastructure to enable the transition to zero emission vehicles. Constance Sharon is with us. Constance is Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. Constance leads the UK automotive industry's engagement with government, political stakeholders and related industries on the political, regulatory and transformational technology agendas in the UK and abroad. Ian Plummer is with us. Ian is the Commercial Director of Auto Trader and his former experience includes his position as Director of Sales Operations at Volkswagen UK. Andy Palmer is with us. Andy is the Chief Executive of Switch. He is also the founder of Palmer Automotive and former Chief Executive of Aston Martin, and myself, who will be chairing. So we'll get into it, and I'll hand over to you, Hugh, first for your 5-minute introductory remarks. The floor is yours.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed to you, to Bright Blue and to Auto Trader for having me. It's great to be on such an esteemed panel. Note it says do not speak for more than 5 minutes or you'll cut me off. You're going to have to because I can't see a clock. So let's work on that basis that you'll be brutal if I go on. And it's also great, obviously, because this is Transport Day of COP26. It's quite interesting, obviously, the announcement today to end the sale of fossil fuel HGVs by 2040. Quite interesting because actually, you note there was a picture of Grant Shapps with an EV car to promote this, because there isn't actually, as far as I'm aware, an EV HGV in place. So here we are now setting targets about something which doesn't actually exist. And I think there's a serious point behind that, which is, targets are a good thing. They're absolutely right, but it shouldn't become gimmick. Otherwise, people will lose faith in it. I want to, if you don't mind, shamelessly plug the Transport Select Committee's report on zero-emission vehicles, which Bright Blue contributed towards. It's a sister report to another report we're putting out, which is on road pricing, which will be out by the end of the year. And I do want to touch on that, if I may, by the end of the year. But some of the things we actually found through our inquiry on zero-emission vehicles, and perhaps I'll bucket it into two parts. One was the sort of cost anxiety in terms of the rollout and getting more take-up. And the other part was the range anxiety, which obviously comes up a lot. And so, really what we're keen to see is the cost of EVs come down, so there is more of a take-up. The market last year, there was a 6.6% share in terms of EV take-up out of all cars sold. That's great because it was an increase of about 180% on the previous year, but it's only 6.6% of the entire sales. And if the aim is to get to 50% by 2025, then we've got a heck of a long way to go before we can do that. So, the big thing is how do we actually get more people to take up EVs? And part of it is the cost. We were attracted to the idea of having a zero-emission vehicle mandate. That is used in 2 states in Canada. China has it, California has it, slightly different though. And what we advocated was where you have sales of EVs, those manufacturers that are selling a good high proportion of them can sell credits to those laggard manufacturers that aren't putting enough EVs into the UK market. So effectively what that's saying to those laggards is that you're going to be paying into the profit margin of your competitors if you don't sell more yourself. And for those that actually take the credits, they're supposed to then reduce the price of EVs, making it more affordable. I prefer that model to a sort of taxpayer subsidy from government because that's all well and good. We have the plug-in grant. That's due to be phased out. But in reality, only those with higher incomes can afford to buy an EV at the moment. So why should those on lower incomes pay their taxes to subsidise those who have more money to actually buy something they themselves can't afford? So really pleased the government has endorsed with our reports. The government has to respond, accept our recommendations or reject them with evidence. And they have accepted that one, albeit very disappointed that the ZEV mandate won't come in until 2024. That's a disappointment. The other part on cost is the problem we have in the UK with regards to residences. So about a third of all households don't have the ability to charge at home. It's about 60 to 80% more expensive if you're charging on the street than it is at home. Part of that is because VAT is charged at 20%, whereas in the home on utilities it's only at 5%. And again, if the poorer households, I shouldn't generalise, would tend not to have a drive, then again that's pricing those individuals out. So again, I think there's much more we need to do on that front. Then the range anxiety, briefly before I run out of time. So, at the moment we've got 20,000 charge points in the country. About a quarter of those are rapid charging. We effectively have 10 EVs for every single charger. In the Netherlands, that's about 4 to 1. So again, we've got a long way to go. The aim is to get to 150,000 in a few years. That's a lot more that have to be delivered. I think the market feels confident it can deliver it, but it needs some help. So our planning rules need reforming so that we actually make charging infrastructure a key part of planning. Local authorities should be given money by the government to actually fund a charging champion whose job it is to actually make sure they put charge points into the authorities. I wrote to my county council to say, why have we not got any charging? And they said, we haven't got any money. Then I wrote back to them saying, well, actually, there's a government fund, a third of it has not been spent. And they said, well, it's too complicated, we don't know how to apply. So we need more help at the local level. But equally, the private sector needs to be budding up with the local authorities to help them bid so they can then spend it on the private sector to deliver. And the other thing I just want to mention before I do run out of time, Patrick, the grid. We keep talking about we'll get more charge points, but can our national grid actually cope with that? National grid think that they can. We've called for the grid to be mapped. We certainly know with some work that we did that there was an estate that was looked at, and if 2 out of 10 households charged up between 6 and 7 when they get back in the evening, it would blow the grid for that entire estate. So we need to look at pricing as a lever to make sure that people charge at the right times and price incentivise them to do that, but also the national grid is invested upon. Very last thing, road pricing. We're still going to need to use the roads, even if we're not using fossil fuel vehicles, we're using EVs. Something's got to pay for it, and we do not seem to be embracing this part. So at the moment, we spend about £7 billion on the roads in England, and we raise about £7 billion on vehicle excise duty. You don't pay that if you have an electric vehicle. Something's going to have to then pay it. We also raised £27 billion off fuel duty. That doesn't go on the roads, that goes to fund our schools, our hospitals, and other forms of general taxation. So the motorist is smart. The motorist knows it's not going to get away with not paying in the same way it has done before. It's good to get take-up of EVs by saying you don't have to pay this at the moment, but my goodness, you will have to pay. If the government don't do something about this now, we will end up with a hodgepodge pattern of local authorities, towns, cities having their own clear air zones, like London, Birmingham, Bath, and it makes it very complicated to then put in the form of national road pricing. I would like to see the ability to get your phone, get priced up on your journey. Actually, if you go now and there's congestion, then it will charge you more, so go at a better time. That again will alter behaviour, perhaps move people onto public transport because you can directly compare pricing. And we could really shake up the market so that we don't just have people moving from fossil fuel vehicles, we actually have them moving off vehicles completely and onto public transport or active travel. So this space is so exciting. But my goodness, the government have been ambitious. This 2030 target is not one that we see in the US, in Germany, in Italy, in India, in China. We do need to see that, because what we see is if you chuck a bomb in, then everyone does then have to react, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. But there's a trajectory to get to 2030, and we're not yet on it. Some of the things that I report, Patrick, I hope will get us there.
I've got a couple of questions for you, Hugh. First is, in terms of different models for EV uptake, there's roughly two. There's the incentive-based model, best depicted by Norway, and then there's more of a regulatory model, for example, like California. It seems like the direction of travel from government is heading more towards a regulatory model with the scaling back of the plug-in car grant and consulting on a ZEV mandate.
Yeah.
How do you balance that? There's still a price premium for EVs compared to ICE vehicles. So, how do you balance that when you're introducing a regulatory model? And my second point was just around road pricing, which I'd be interested to get your thoughts on. Is there not a risk that by introducing road pricing at this point, we might make EVs look unattractive and that could hinder their uptake?
Yeah, so let me deal with the second point first of all. I mean, that's absolutely the case. When we did our evidence session on road pricing, I didn't want anyone from the Department for Transport to give evidence, as they normally would with our committee, because that's the department we scrutinise, because they would just come along and said, no, there's no policy intent there, because their driver, understandably, is to get more people to take EVs. And one of the big sales at the moment is that you don't pay fuel duty, you don't pay vehicle excise duty. So that's why we got someone in from the Treasury instead, because their driver is making sure that they get the tax yield in. So there's a bit of a battle going on in government, let's be frank, to sort of make sure that, on the one hand, we encourage people to take up EVs, do the right thing, but at the same time, we're sensible about our country's finances. And we know at the moment the tax take is high. So if we then see that yield drop, and so I've seen the charts, it will actually get phased right down to zero as everything is EV, then something is going to have to pay. And then we can either do that by other forms of taxation, which, as we saw from national insurance, is not popular, or we can actually say, let's charge you for the road that you actually use, and perhaps hypothecate it a bit better than we do at the moment. So I think also the British public, the global public, is not stupid. They know ultimately that someone's got to pay for this. And so, whilst people may be sold the pitch inside Tesla that you won't have to pay fuel duty or vehicle excise duty, I think people know full well that someone's going to have to pay, and it's normally them. On your other part, yeah, you're right. Look at Norway. Their 75% market share is EVs compared to our 6.6%, clearly doing something well. We are moving more towards the sort of nudge regulation. The zero emission mandate, I think, is a really good way. If nothing else, motor manufacturers that don't put enough in, so I don't know, maybe harsh, but use Toyota, are going to loathe the fact they're going to end up subsidising the profit margin of a competitor. So I think that's more likely to succeed than the current sort of subsidy, which, as I say, just tends to subsidise the rich. We do know when you intervene, things change. So when we dropped the ceiling from 50,000 to 35,000, where the plug-in hybrid grant could be used, the price of the vehicle fell to the same time. So actually, we know that when the market is sort of shaken up a bit, it does respond. Interoperability is the thing we have to get right, and the government has promised to legislate. It's too complicated. There are too many different accounts to go and charge, and that again holds people back. Should be like roaming is across the globe, and again, that's where the government will intervene. But finally, intervening is always the danger that we don't just create a market, which we have to create, we can also kill it. And I think that's where we have to be really, really careful that our policies don't have unintended consequences.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Graham, I'll pass to you now. The floor is yours for your introductory remarks.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Patrick, and thanks for inviting me along. Welcome to Glasgow if you're not from here. I'm assured there are hundreds of people watching right now, although there's not hundreds in the room, clearly. When I got in, I was shown this lovely booklet and was reminded that I'd written something in it, so you can read that later. And luckily for you, there is something in there about transport, which is my current role. And I mentioned there that I would like to see transport joined up. That would be nice, wouldn't it? You should be able to hop on a train, the underground, a tram, bus or ferry with just one card. And the lucky delegates to COP26 can do exactly that because they've been given a card and they can travel anywhere in Scotland for nothing. Those of us who live here cannot do that. So the technology clearly exists and we should be using it, and we should be rolling out that technology across the country. Because although we're here to talk about electric vehicles, we need to look at things, we need to look at transport as a whole. So we need to get more people cycling. I'm a big enthusiast for cycling, more people walking, more people on public transport. So that's my pitch for public transport. You've asked me to talk about electric vehicles. Now, you mentioned in your introduction that I'm on the cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament for cycling, walking and buses. No, I'm not, because that group no longer exists. We have a new Parliament and we're going to create a new group called the Cross-Party Group on Sustainable Transport. So that will also include trains. And one of the problems with cross-party groups in the Scottish Parliament, unlike, I think, Westminster and the group that Hugh chairs, is that they've been largely talking shops, where people, probably like you and the people on this panel, gather every few months, talk amongst themselves, agree with each other, and all go home, either physically or now virtually, pat each other on the backs, and that's it. Now, I'm going to convene this new group, and I want it to be more like the all-party groups that we have in Westminster, and actually do stuff, produce reports, produce recommendations. So if we're looking at electric vehicles, what we could be looking at is, well, what is the state of play in Scotland? So I've done my own research on that. Hugh was telling me when I walked in, he's got an SNP colleague on his committee who keeps telling him how great things are in Scotland. So, well, let's have a look at that, shall we? We're actually nowhere near the point where there are enough charging points in Scotland to persuade most drivers to make the switch to electric vehicles. I'm one of those drivers. I was in the position earlier this year of thinking I'm now ready to change my petrol car for something else. So clearly electric came into the mix, hybrid came into the mix, and what did I get? A petrol car. I got a petrol car because, frankly, getting electric right now, for me, I think would be it would be too expensive. I couldn't afford one. B, I think it would be too much hassle to actually run one. If I needed to go on a long journey, I think I would struggle in terms of getting the car charged up. I mean, clearly, if I want to go and visit my daughter who lives down south, I can do that. I can just hop in my car and get there, fill up on the way, and it's really not much of a hassle. If I had an electric car, I'm not sure what the deal would be. If we look across Scotland, I'm just going to read you some figures out. At the end of June, there were 2,558 public chargers in Scotland. As Hugh said, just over 24,000 across the UK. 4 months later in Scotland, there were 2,751. Only 657 of them were rapid chargers. So if you're like me and you just want to fill up, shall we say, and get going, then I'm only interested in rapid chargers because I want to get on the move. So in 4 months, 193 chargers were installed. There's a target for 30,000 charge points in Scotland by 2030. That means we need to be fitting 4,000 chargers a year. But at the current rates, we're managing 579. So to get to those 30,000 charge points will take about 45 years. 45 years at current rates. And I'm being generous there. 45 years. So if we're going to continue at our current pace here in Scotland, and Hugh can tell Gavin Newlands this when he next sees him, then we need to be getting to about 8,000 chargers a year, not the figure that I've given. So we're currently way short of that target. Why 2030? Why are they saying 2030? Because that's when there'll be no new petrol or diesel cars sold. But I factored that in when I bought my petrol car because I hang on to vehicles for quite a while. I think they're going to be here for some time. So I think there will still be a market, even in 2030, for second-hand, mainly petrol, maybe not so much diesel, but petrol cars. So I think there'll be a lot of people like me who are not ready to make the switch. Now, I'm not against electric vehicles. I think it'll come, but things really need to change. 1 minute left. Right. I will touch on some of the things that Hugh said about things that need to change, and he touched on something I feel very strongly about. I've got a detached house. Clearly, if I bought an electric vehicle, I could install my own charger. I've got a driveway. A lot of Scotland is flatted or tenement developments in this city. So it's not possible, you're not going to trail a cable out of your top floor window onto the street. So I think we do need to change the regulatory system to help people in flats, which is a lot of Scotland, to have chargers in the street. And I think if you've got private flatted developments, one idea that I've heard, which I think would be a good idea, this could work on the street as well, is that you could charge people to use your chargers. So the people living in those flatted developments might actually get something out of it. So I'll leave it there. I'm up against the clock, and there are people with a lot more expertise than me. I'm just a layman, and I've told you why I haven't got an electric vehicle.
Thank you very much, Graham. I think you've done a good job of highlighting a lot of the barriers that consumers feel when they're considering purchasing an EV. I'll hand over to you now, Annalisa, for your 5-minute introductory remarks.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I always enjoy hearing what's happening with other jurisdictions. The presentations given already remind me that we're all facing the same thing regardless of which jurisdiction we come from. The issues are very similar. California has been working to achieve health-based air quality standards for over 50 years, and we've made a lot of progress. But we still have the case that 90% of our citizens, our residents, are exposed to unhealthy levels of air quality at times through the year. And so we're continuing to work very hard to reduce emissions from our transport sector, which represents the majority of the emissions, and especially in our disadvantaged low-income communities that have borne the burden of diesel emissions and petrol emissions running through their communities. We're focused on really cleaning up our transport. We've done that through regulations to reduce emissions from tailpipes to requiring zero-emission vehicles. But we had a fundamental event happen last year, actually a little more than a year now, with the signing of Governor Newsom's executive order calling for the 100% transition to zero-emission vehicles, 100% new car sales for light-duty vehicles, passenger cars and light trucks, and the complete transition to on-road heavy-duty drayage trucks, which are short haul between ports and warehouses by 2035, so not just new trucks, but all trucks replaced. And the replacement of other sectors of the medium and heavy-duty fleet over the course of between 2035 and 2040. And we're accomplishing that through a combination of policies, including regulation. We have the Advanced Clean Cars regulation for the sale of cars. We have the Clean Mile Standard, which is a fleet-based regulation aimed at companies like Uber and Lyft, the networked transport companies, requiring zero-emission miles for their trips. On the medium and heavy-duty side, we have our Advanced Clean Truck regulation, which requires manufacturers to start building and selling trucks that are zero-emission. The Innovative Clean Transit regulation, which is a fleet-based regulation, transforming our transit agencies to zero-emission between now and 2040. And we're working on Advanced Clean Fleets, which will require fleets of 50 or more, and the drayage truck fleets to purchase zero-emission trucks. And then concurrent with that, we're also working on Advanced Clean Cars 2, which will be the next phase of our passenger car regulations, which will take us from our current regulation that runs through 2025 up through 2035, and 100% of new car sales being zero-emission. And to the question of which works better, regulation or incentives, California is of the mind that it takes a whole suite of policies. So we have our regulations, which are both supply side and demand side in many cases, but we also have incentives. They have been purchase incentives for the most part, but we're focusing more of that as the population of new car sales is increasing. We're focusing those efforts on low-income buyers, those in disadvantaged communities, and on the medium and heavy-duty sectors. And we're also extremely focused on infrastructure. Without infrastructure, if you don't know where you're going to fuel the car, you're not going to buy it. So we are committing over $1 billion in the next 3 years towards infrastructure, both light duty with DC fast charge points and public level 2 chargers, as well as projects for medium and heavy duty. In particular, we have the need to figure out how to put in infrastructure for large fleets that are transitioning to zero-emission trucks and vans in a way which works for them and addresses their concerns. My focus, I've been involved in the light-duty zero-emission vehicle space for many, many years, but my focus starting this year has been to focus exclusively on infrastructure, and that's across all the sectors. And what's come out of that with my work with stakeholders and state agencies, federal agencies, is that there are a lot of whatabouts. What about, is there enough electricity on the grid? What about the time it takes to get infrastructure installed? What about the costs? And what we're learning is all of those are surmountable. There are a lot of, as many stakeholders who are concerned about those things. There are agencies and utilities and industry which are ready to come together with innovative solutions in order to address them. And we have opportunities as part of this transition to see new business models and new ways of addressing fueling and infrastructure. So, yeah.
Thank you, Annalisa. I just had a couple of questions.
Yeah.
First, relative to other US states, California's EV uptake is quite impressive. Have other US states sought to emulate the policy package of California? And my second question is, I know that you have high occupancy vehicle lane access for EVs. Obviously, as more people buy EVs, you don't want to run the risk of clogging up the high occupancy vehicle lane. So do you plan in the sort of near term to do away with that policy?
So your first question about the other states that are emulating California, yes, we have special dispensation under the U.S. Clean Air Act to adopt regulations for motor vehicles that are different from the federal government. Other states can adopt our regulations. They can't adopt a third set of standards. And I believe we're up to 12 states which have adopted the California standards, mostly in the Northeast, also our neighbors to the north, Oregon and Washington. Oregon. Washington keeps getting close. They have our tailpipe standards, but not our ZEV standards yet. And we're starting to gather steam with other states like Colorado. So yeah, it's growing. And with regard to our high occupancy vehicle lane, the carpool lane, we have been adjusting that program over the years. Initially it was, if you have a ZEV, you get a sticker, you're good. It's actually changed now that you can choose. Pick your incentive. You get the HOV lane sticker or you get an incentive. You can't have both. And the sticker is, it expires. So it changes color every couple of years. So that limits the total volume of zero emission vehicles. But it has been a game changer in terms of the attractiveness of zero emission vehicles, especially in the urban areas like the Bay Area and Los Angeles.
Thank you very much, Annalisa. Constance, I'll hand over to you now for your introductory remarks.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Good morning, everybody here. Good morning, everybody on the screen. Also, I'm delighted to be here and talk with all of you esteemed guests here about this subject. Just looking at the question that you've been asking us, and Auto Trader have been asking us, are we charging up and maturing the market for EVs? I think I just want to make three major remarks to just kick us off, really. A little bit on where we are now. Are we actually charging up? Then what do we actually need to accelerate or mature the market going forward? And then how do we get there, just to give a bit of an impression. So are we charging up? I would say an absolute yes. You just need to look out there what's going on. As an industry, massive investment is happening in new models of EVs. I think there's not a week now going by where you wouldn't hear about a major commitment by OEMs, whether that's cars or, dare I say it, also in other areas like buses and HGVs moving forward. We've got already 150 models that in the next few years is meant to double. And I think just to pick up Hugh on the figures, I mean, this is even more astonishing because we are just coming out of, or we're still in the middle of, living with COVID. And the overall industry and market has reduced by 30%. And the one bright spot of that market has been actually the plug-in market growing and expanding. And I think the figures you used earlier on, in 2020, we were in terms of plug-ins already at 10.7%. And that's absolutely nowhere near where we need to be ultimately to get to the end point. But in terms of going forward, that's great. And if you look at the figures already for this year, we publish them every month, so they are all out there for you to look at. If you put battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids together, you're already at 16.6%, of which 10% is battery electric vehicles. So the majority is battery electric vehicle. So a lot of things are happening. We've already sold 230,000. We expect by the end of the year probably 287,000 plug-in vehicles being sold in the UK market. And that is more than we've sold between 2010 and 2019. So something has definitely changed. We are charging up. But what do we need to do to accelerate? And I really take the question of maturing the market seriously because it is something slightly different, and I hope we get into this one. Well, I think the number one question is how do we get from where we are now, which is still, if you're really honest, an early market. 10%, 9.9%, that's not a majority market. That's still an early market. So the number one thing you don't do is take your foot off the accelerator. So when it comes to the discussion that we just had, and I think Annalisa said we need it all, don't we? And I think I'm in your camp on that one. So talking first of all around incentives. So alongside regulation, to that question, is it regulation or is it incentives? And the truth is you will need both if you want to be leading. If you want to be top there with your ambition levels, with your targets, then you need to also think about what is actually the package that I need to bring on board to get people like Graham on board to make the change now and not to delay the change, because that's the trajectory we know. So really on incentives, we need to have a proper discussion because it's not just about hearts and minds. This is about price parity, total cost of ownership, and we are not there, whatever you would discuss. So I hope we come into that in more detail. I think the second point is absolutely about infrastructure. we need, now that we are getting targets for the market, targets alone don't create markets. You need the confidence and the infrastructure, which is the biggest change here, to actually get people to buy these vehicles. So how about targets or ambition levels there? We are really looking forward to what's coming out of the infrastructure strategy. And we need to work on consumer experience. These are not new items that I'm mentioning here. These are consistently coming from consumers as the major issue: reliability, transparency, price transparency. It needs to be as easy as filling up their cars now, if not easier. So I think there's both about increasing the volume, working on whether the network can actually and the grid can actually cope, but critically the consumer is at the heart of this transition. And then last but not least, if you want to get costs down, you need to work with industry here in the UK and elsewhere to actually get these vehicles, get a competitive business environment, invest in the technology, trying to get the batteries made ideally here, and all the infrastructure and all the supply chain growth. That's the big opportunity we have, and we need to do it because otherwise we will not get the price down. So in a nutshell, how do we get there? As I say, I think number one, we need a really mature discussion. I don't think it's an either or between regulation and incentives. We will absolutely have a big discussion on how the regulatory framework can be enabling, how a ZEV mandate with a CO2 element in it, plus incentives can be enabled, but we can't suddenly switch one off. And as you said, Hugh, regulation comes in 2024. Plug-in car grant potentially ends 2022-23, if not earlier, if it runs out. How do you fill the gap? Are you prepared to take a cliff edge into account? Probably not. I don't think that's the intention, but we might risk it, so we need to do this. Secondly, the forthcoming infrastructure strategy. I think it needs to be really clear. I mean, obviously it will be mainly cars and vans, but it needs to be really clear where we're going. It needs to create confidence in investors, confidence for consumers, and also need to be enabling for those local authorities from whom we demand so much. If I have a lot of sympathy, local authorities need to do a lot, but we need to enable them as well as the private sector going forward. And then last but not least, I think the wider ecosystem. I know we've spoken mainly about cars, but in a minute we hear about buses. Fantastic, not just unsung. This is a hero of the industry, in bus manufacturing. UK has a real opportunity to move forward. We just need to make the government's bus strategy and the commitments that are already made now happening on the ground. These buses just need to come out because our members want to get them out, and HCVs. Maybe we'll come at that later. But I'll stop here. So these are the sort of three things that I'm looking forward to.
Thank you very much, Constance. And just a reminder to our virtual audience as well, if you would like to ask a question, the link to Slido where you can do so is found just below the video live stream in the description box. I'll hand over now to Andy for your introductory remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I really wanted to make 5 key points today, but I thought I'd start with a little bit of an introduction just to give credibility behind what I'm talking about. So 42 years in the auto industry, and 15 years ago I started a project that became the Nissan Leaf, which was arguably the first modern day EV project, and that resulted in building 3 gigafactories around the world. What's interesting for me is that many of the conversations that we started having 15 years ago, and to some extent a disappointment, is that I find a lot of those questions still being raised even today. Maybe Leaf was ahead of its time, but basically we still have, for example, definition issues of what we think are zero emission cars or net zero cars, and I'll come on to that in a second. Today, I would say that I'm involved in 5 different areas of net zero transportation. One is being the CEO of Switch. Thank you for the introduction around buses. Switch was born during COVID, where we pulled together 2 companies, Optare in the UK and Ashok Leyland in India, and created a new company called Switch, which from its get-go is net zero carbon. I'm going to come back to that net zero carbon definition because it's really important. I'm also chairman of Inabat, which is a Slovakian EV battery company. I'd like to touch on industrial strategy during the course of this introduction, because if we don't bring gigafactories to the United Kingdom, then we won't have an automotive industry in 10 years' time. I'm Senior Independent Director of PodPoint, which is the largest charging point provider in the UK. I'd like to talk a little bit about levelling up, to use a common term around the charging infrastructure. I'm chairman of a company called Hilo, which is EV scooters. The last 1 mile is really, really important. And consultant to manufacturer of something called hot hydrogen. And I'd like to talk about alternatives to net zero. So 15 years ago, we started talking about zero emission vehicles. And really what we were talking about was zero emission from the vehicle. And at that time, we had also a terminology which has got lost somewhere in translation called well to wheel. And I see the terminology of zero emissions being misunderstood over and over and over and over again. If you buy an electric vehicle, and let's be clear, I'm the greatest advocate of electric vehicles, but if you buy an electric vehicle, you are not buying zero emission vehicle. In fact, it takes about 70% more carbon to build an electric vehicle than it does an internal combustion vehicle. So when you talk about getting to net zero, yes, zero from the tailpipe is important, but also the energy that you put into the vehicle to charge it has to be sustainable. And the energy that you use to build the vehicle, and in particular the battery, and as I talk as a manufacturer of batteries, also has to be zero. And unless you get those right, then you haven't got a zero emission car. And that's really important, given that this whole conference is around the drive to net zero. So simply telling the consumer, move to EV, is not the entire answer. And we need to make that clear to the consumer, that they should be asking the question, is this means of transportation, is it zero emission from the tailpipe, or is it net zero overall? And there's very few that will be able to claim the latter. Interestingly, that's the whole purpose of Switch as a bus provider. From the get-go, it's net zero. And we have to, as a business, help to explain the benefits of that to the consumer. So the other thing that I want to say, really point to, is that I often hear, particularly at this conference, people saying in 2030 or 2035, because the regulations aren't clear to people, that we're going to ban the internal combustion engine. We're not. The internal combustion engine will continue to play a role in the drive towards net zero. So, for example, e-fuel. E-fuel is basically the ability to draw carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it basically back into a fuel. Or something called hot hydrogen, which is probably the most logical solution for heavy goods vehicles. That's the ability to combust hydrogen in an internal combustion engine. Obviously, when you combust hydrogen with oxygen, you get water. So I think we need, again, to be very clear, what we're trying to drive towards is net zero. And we should be very careful about the terminology we use, like we're only going to adopt electric vehicles. Electric vehicles will be the vast majority of cars in the future. But around the edges, and we've sort of skirted around it so far, around the edges, electric vehicles probably don't make sense for things like heavy goods vehicles, for things like vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, and for things like aircrafts. So we need to be open-minded, and in that sense we need Darwinism to work. So by promoting various technologies, we allow the fittest to survive, and that will also help us, for example, bring down the cost of EVs. Which brings me on to my third point, which is obviously this technology is relatively expensive, and in that sense, public transport and alternatives, we need a suite of alternatives for mobility that help us to get us around. Buses are all around democratization of transportation, and therefore democratization of net zeros. But there are also opportunities of things like mobility as a service, where industry can help turning movement, basically lowering the entry barrier from turning a CapEx model to an OpEx model. And my company is in fact using something called OHM, which is a company that promotes mobility as a service in India as a way of reducing the entries. Fourth point we've already covered, which is charging infrastructure. Almost all of the charging infrastructure exists in London. It needs to reach outside London. And my last point is through this revolution that we're going through, let's not export those green jobs. It's really important that we have an industrial strategy in the United Kingdom that, for example, looks at how we bring gigafactories to the UK so that we preserve those 860,000 jobs that are automotive in the UK. We don't talk about it very much. We're at risk of losing it. We don't have the gigafactories that we need, and we need to find a way of bringing them here. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I just want to pick up on that last comment you made. What would you like to see from the government to make it more attractive to have gigafactories in the UK?
Bizarrely, I'm not going to tell you a load of incentives, although that will help because our incentives for building gigafactories in the UK are significantly less than in Europe, so we're not competitive. But actually the main point is a demand thing, which is somehow or other you need to make it clear to OEMs manufacturing in the United Kingdom that it's not acceptable to buy your batteries from elsewhere. So you can do that, it can be a carrot and stick, but basically in the same way as the EU has said, you have to have 70% of your battery content made in Europe, the UK as an independent entity now needs to say, you know, Mr. JLR, Mr. Mini, Mr. Vauxhall, unless you're utilising a certain proportion of your batteries from the UK, then you won't get further incentives.
Okay, brilliant. Ian, I'll hand over to you now for your 5-minute introductory remarks.
Great, thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here. Great to partner with Bright Blue for this event, and great to hear so many interesting views from the panelists that are here today. I'm really looking forward to also now sharing some data and some consumer insights from a report that we're publishing today about our progress in the UK along the road to 2030, the road to zero emissions. And within that, there is some positive news. There's a lot of great progress, but also we're seeing quite a lot of speed bumps or breaks, if you like, along that road. So we need to talk about those, understand them, and address them. If you'd like to see the report in more detail, you can check that out at Autotrader roadto2030.co.uk. So I want to focus today principally on what I think the major issue that we need to address is all around as we face up to the acceleration we need in EVs, which is around mass adoption. And for that, I think we need EVs to be simpler to choose, more affordable to buy, and then more convenient to own. I think we've touched on all of those respective points during the course of this discussion. But to get to that point and to address those issues, I think we need to try and focus on 3 I's, right across the industry and across government as well. Those I's would be incentives, the investment, infrastructure you could say as well, and information. Now, on Autotrader's platform, we can see an awful lot about what's going on from a consumer behavior point of view, and there is, as I said, a lot of progress. We can see very clearly that there is a huge rise in interest, in consideration, in choice, and that the consumers are acting, if you like, with their feet, or at least with their keyboards. 1 in 4 buyers now on Autotrader who are considering a new car viewed an electric car on our site last month. That number's grown 4-fold in the last year. Equally, at the start of the year, 1 in 20 new cars that were viewed on Autotrader were electric. That's now 1 in 5. Similarly, we've talked earlier, Hugh mentioned the sales numbers. We're roughly doubling our sales numbers. So it's great to see a lot more interest. Consumers are acting. But I think we're also in danger of allowing these recent increases in sales and the positive vibes that are out there, masking what I think is a relatively inconvenient and uncomfortable truth. Now, we see with around 11 million unique visitors on Autotrader each month, we can see very clearly the type of actual consumer behavior that I've just given you a flavour of. Interest is rising, but frankly, the true intent hasn't yet reached the majority. Now, the problem, I think, frankly, is that only wealthier and older people are currently actually buying the electric vehicles that are out there. Interest and curiosity and even a desire to do the right thing simply aren't enough for most people to translate their interest into a sale. So as things stand, the significant pricing barriers and the perceived lack of infrastructure and equally some lingering myths that are blocking consumer mindsets to make the shift, will prevent, I think, the required rate of adoption for EVs that we need to see. And that's why we believe that those three strands of work on incentives, investment and information are really required urgently to increase the uptake of EVs very, very quickly. And unless those areas are addressed, I do frankly think that the road to 2030 is at risk. So today, the fundamental problem I think we need to face up to is one of affordability. And there remains what Bill Gates would call the green premium, some people who are able to afford to do the right thing, and it's great that they can. And they need to, with the case of electric vehicles, because there is this extra price involved in buying one of these cars. So we need to give all people the means to be green. In our Road to 2030 report, you can see that although the gap has narrowed in the last couple of years and progress has been made, we are on a good trajectory, EVs on our platform are still roughly around 38% more expensive to buy than their ICE equivalents. Now that is a significant gap that gets in the way of most people. What you see therefore when you look at the demographic analysis, that the wealthier postcodes are the ones where people are actually looking at these cars. So 6 of the 10 hotspots are London boroughs, the likes of Putney and Kensington and so on. If you look outside of London, it's places like Harrogate and Bath, and the wealthier postcodes of South Manchester, Cheshire and so on, where people are really interested in these cars. In fact, when you compare with the car buying average, those people with the highest interest in buying EVs right now and making the switch are likely to have a household income, twice as likely, to have a household income of more than £75,000. So it's a very significant divide. So to be clear, if we think that the current and the planned range of incentives are enough to address these barriers, and I think frankly we are mistaken, we need to do more. Now, the government has pledged more money in this area, and that's very welcome, but I don't think it goes far enough to bridge these price gaps. The reality is that it won't be nearly enough to bridge the gap for the middle income of the UK, the mainstream of the UK, to actually make the jump. And they need to be able to find an affordable vehicle in a budget range that's priced at an equivalent ICE level that they're used to seeing. So this is frankly the nut we need to crack, and it's not about therefore getting high-earning people sort of buying another Jaguar I-Pace or whatever great car as they are. It's more about getting mass adoption, where we think smarter and more targeted incentives to enable everybody to be able to make this green shift, and that could well mean, I think, means-tested grants to allow the bridging of this gap and allow more people to actually jump into the green premium that is unfortunately the reserve of the wealthy today. Now, if the incentives can bridge the gap in the next few years, I believe that will encourage the kind of volumes and the kind of economies of scale that manufacturers require in order to get to the kind of price parity point which we can hopefully achieve more naturally, we believe, by the middle of this decade, if we continue in that trajectory I talked to at the moment, and we can reduce this 38% gap down to hopefully nothing. But we need the incentives to help fuel that growth in the meantime. Briefly, what about the other two I's I've mentioned? Well, first, we touched a lot, I think, already on the investment required in infrastructure, and we think that investment in charging needs to be supply-led. I think we've touched on it earlier, Graham mentioned it, I think Constance mentioned it as well. We need to be reassuringly convincing to people who are thinking about buying an electric vehicle that there is a solution for them before they've bought it, rather than waiting for it to be put in place once they've bought it. We can't be sort of chicken and egg on this one. We've got to be bold, and we've got to support the investment decisions, which otherwise won't be made by private investors until such time as the actual demand is out there. And we need the infrastructure solutions to provide both a solution to those people we've touched on earlier who need a solution that won't be their own home charging. They need something nearby their own home so they can charge regularly, but equally those fast chargers along the route that you'll be taking for those longer journeys, let's say for Graham coming down south to see his daughter. And as Constance said, we need refueling. Today is very easy. We need recharging to be as easy as refueling. And if things are convenient, as I touched on earlier, as well as affordable, people will change the habits of a lifetime. Which brings me on to the last I, that of information. We do need to tackle what I think are very ingrained habits. For decades, people have got used to what an ICE does and what it is. They know how to buy one, they know how to own one. To change habits, we need to have a lot more focus on information. And I think as an industry, we've probably been a little bit off beam so far. Focusing on the green is great. Focusing on some sort of rather nebulous sort of future buying model and ownership model is a little bit too far off for most people. So we need to focus on the fun, the performance of these cars. We need to bust some myths about, the charging difficulties that are out there. Usually they're overthought and overcomplicated. They can be bust. I do believe also that the information can help us understand the cost benefits, the total cost of ownership, which I do believe at the moment, given the state of the price parity issue that I've described, is absolutely fundamental for people to bridge the gap that they're seeing when they're buying a car. We can't ignore that, and we can't assume that people will factor that out, I don't believe, of their calculations when buying a car. So all of that, I think, is necessary to attract consumers, both at a rational but also at an emotional level, to really encourage them to make what is, frankly, still a bold decision. Making it easier for them, making it more attractive is fundamentally necessary. And we look forward to playing our role across the industry in trying to deal with those many challenges.
Thank you very much, Ian. I just wanted to pick up on your policy suggestion you made around means-tested grants and ask you, Hugh, is this something that the Transport Committee has considered before?
No, actually, funny enough, I know it's something that you've considered at Bright Blue. I think your suggestion was a £2,000 grant for the lower, for those with lower incomes. So shameless plug for Bright Blue there, right? So no, we have looked at this, but I think our feeling is rather than the taxpayer actually footing the bill for this, for other taxpayers to then buy, that we expect the motor manufacturing industry to sort this out, which is why we looked more at the zero emission vehicles mandate. So I mean, that's our sort of proposal. I know in Scotland there's an interest-free loan that was introduced for second-hand ZEVs, which of course are hard to come by. I think it's 0.3% of the market. The second-hand market is ZEVs. That's because there just aren't enough coming through, and the industry feels that will just happen over time. So our approach is not the taxpayer. Look, the taxpayer is going to be footing the bill on the infrastructure. It's a bit like rail to a certain extent. It's always been the case that the taxpayer actually builds the sort of capital, the infrastructure, the new lines, the new stations, but the user actually pays for the service and doesn't get the subsidy. So the government is obviously putting a £1.3 billion charging infrastructure fund together. So that's where the taxpayer is sort of paying. So I prefer that than actually subsidies for other taxpayers to actually take this up.
Come in there.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with Hugh, because I'm not convinced it's up to the government to help any of us buy a car. I'm not sure it's their job, but it is their job to provide the infrastructure. Now, when I was describing my own journey, if you excuse the expression, I'm not quite there yet, obviously, into electric cars, and I said I bought a petrol car, which I will have for quite a number of years. There's going to come a point where I won't be able to buy a new petrol car, and that point will come fairly soon. I think governments are going to have to, at some point, introduce a scrappage scheme for petrol and diesel cars if they want to get them off the road, and that will have to run for a number of years, because I think it's only fair, if people are running these vehicles and then suddenly they find out because of government policy they can't keep them on the road, they can't buy a new petrol vehicle. That's where I think government will have to step in. Of course, we've had scrappage schemes before and they've been quite successful. So I think it's something they will have to look at. Not yet, but further down the line.
Thank you, Graham. I'm going to open the floor now for Q&A. So if anybody has a question, do raise your hand and the roaming mic will come to you. So are there any questions? You, sir. Yeah.
Hi there, it's Neil Wallace of Zemo Partnership. Thanks to Bright Blue and the panel for a very interesting discussion. Hugh mentioned interoperability. As we've got Annalisa here, I'd be interested to hear the California experience on this and if it's an issue there. Secondly, what comes to mind is there hasn't been any mention of sort of the whole life impacts, about end of use, about what we're going to do with all these batteries as they come to the end of their lives. Do we need more regulation incentives, or at least to be thinking about that at this point?
Annalisa?
Sure. So yes, interoperability and ease of access for chargers has definitely been an issue in California. So much so that our legislature decided to pass a law that said that membership at a public charging station would not be required in order to access that station, and that payment by credit card had to be included. And so the requirements for that are going into effect January 1st for DC fast chargers, and then we'll phase in for level 2 chargers as well. In addition to that, we also adopted regulations that require interoperability standards installed on all of those chargers that are available to the public, so that so that interoperability agreements between networks are enabled. So that will be up to the charging networks to make those agreements. But fundamentally, anybody can drive up to a charger and pay with a credit card, hopefully reducing that friction, reducing the complications of accessing public charging, and the friction there of it being different from buying a gallon of petrol. It's not necessarily the most popular requirement that we've adopted on the part of the charging companies, but from the consumer standpoint, it's obvious that it's needed.
Thank you, Annalisa. Andy, I wonder if you could pick up on the gentleman's second question there around whole life emissions, scrappage, and perhaps talk about battery recycling, because we haven't actually touched on that yet.
We could talk about batteries for the entire conference, I guess. Incredibly complex topic, but so the first thing you need to ask when you're sort of buying a battery is what's the emissions of the battery? And look, there's many different numbers, but the number I most often refer to is it takes around about 7 kilowatt hours of energy to create 1 kilowatt hour of battery. So you've got an awful lot of sustainable energy that you need to bring in if you're going to make clean batteries. And then of course you've got to deal with end of life, which is part of your question. End of life of a vehicle battery isn't the end of the life of the battery. Typically over a period of, let's say, 6 to 10 years, depending on how you use it, the battery will decay by about 20 to 25%. In other words, it will only be capable of holding about 80% of the charge that it had when it was new. That's normal. Obviously, you've still got an 80% capacity of battery as it becomes no longer useful for a car. So the first step in recycling is actually one of reuse, and looking at how you can reuse the battery, for example, as a storage medium, whether it's storage medium at a wind farm, a solar farm, in your home, but you've still got useful capacity there that you can use. The final step, the third step if you want, is one of recycling. Interestingly, lithium-ion batteries are recyclable. You can bring them back to what's called a black mass, which is not quite down to the mineral level, but down to a level that you can then reuse in your new batteries. And again, when you're creating industrial strategies for the type of battery makers you want in your particular country, I think the two things that you need to ask is, are you using sustainable energy to manufacture the batteries, and are you bringing recyclable capability to the country to make sure that you're using a portion of your new materials from old, and those are the two key points. But what I will say, and often misunderstood, is that you can recycle lithium-ion batteries.
Thank you, Andy. Constance.
Yeah, Patrick, if I could just comment on Neil's question there. I think whether it is regulation or incentive, one thing is clear for the OEMs. There's a massive incentive to try and recover materials that, as we've just recently seen, I think it was the beginning of this week, that we had the IEA talk about the spike in prices for really key materials going forward. So trying to recover those, but at a sort of grade that you can actually reuse them and actually turn them into something else, is something that all the manufacturers have to now plan in, because they're already thinking about a future where actually the biggest environmental impact is not anymore the tailpipe emission of the vehicles, but it is actually the energy balance throughout the production of the vehicle, and it is the kind of materials and where they come from. So I do think you're asking an absolutely right question, and we need to go much further, because at the moment we don't have that material chain yet to really have the business models to create this. But all of this is coming, and it's absolutely 100% on the cards, and it will again be a combination of normal business models coming to play, regulation around batteries coming to play, and other areas. So I would say watch that space, and dare I say also there's opportunities. You know, we have in our membership definitely companies that are looking forward to try and find a way of providing manufacturers with a reliable quality of material that is probably as good as virgin material, but it's recovered, and that's where we need to get to. So any support for that would be appreciated.
Thank you, Constance. Ian, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just briefly, I think we like to see things from the point of view of the consumer. Consumers are generally confused at the moment because they've been told to buy one thing, now they've been told to buy another one, and they think things are going to be banned in a way that they aren't necessarily going to be banned. They don't even know there's a government grant in place in many cases. 54% of people in a recent survey we did responded to that degree. So we have confused people by telling them, for example, to buy diesel and then thinking that that's an awful thing to do these days. Now, as has been pointed out several times, those, let's say, diesel Euro 6 engines, the more recent ones, are on the road today. They don't emit much nitrogen oxide. Their CO2 levels are pretty good. They've been built. The emissions have been put into the production process. So throwing those away too soon is a naive point to bear in mind. But we're telling people to buy electric vehicles. That's the vibe. They think they need to do it. Then, like I said earlier, they consider that. They look at it, then they see the price, and they go away. Inaction isn't going to help anybody here. What we need to do is try and get rid of some of that confusion and give a little bit more clarity. Make sure people know that, for example, on road pricing, if we are going to start charging people for road usage, let's tell them that now so that they don't make a decision on total cost of ownership. Let's be clearer with people. So, for example, we think environmentally friendly choices is our new three-letter acronym, EFCs, in our world in Auto Trader. We're trying to enable people to understand the carbon footprint, for example, of a particular Euro 6 or maybe Euro 4 petrol or diesel. Now, some of those choices that people can make can be better than the ones that they're currently driving. And I'd like to consider that as a sort of, if you like, a step in the right direction for many consumers. Not necessarily a leap all the way over here to electric vehicles or a jump to a hybrid. Every step, as we hear it often in COP, is positive. So enabling people to understand the data around those sort of steps forward, I think is really useful. And I think giving that long-term clarity of government policy can be a real key part of that clarity we need to give.
We've got a lot of questions coming in online, so I will address our virtual audience briefly. I've got a question here which I'll put to you, Graham, from an anonymous person who asks, how well has the interest-free loan of up to £35,000 worked in Scotland for used and new EVs, and is it likely to be introduced throughout the UK? I might come to you on that second part, Hugh, but Graham, if you could share with us your reflections on the interest-free loan.
I'm sorry to the anonymous questioner, but I don't have figures on that. I wish I did. My impression is it's not been hugely successful. As far as it being rolled out across the UK, absolutely no idea. Hugh might know more than me.
Well, we looked at the sort of Scotland model for the second-hand market. I mean, we were actually struggling in terms of what to do with the second-hand market because there isn't a market for it at the moment, and it will come down the line. So I don't think we were sort of persuaded that was actually a good use of taxpayers' money. I'll come back to it. If the biggest percentage in terms of reasons why I wouldn't take up an EV is actually range anxiety, not enough charging, then that I think is where the government's better putting its money in building that infrastructure, as Graham had mentioned as well. So I think at the moment, to answer the question, it's unlikely that it will be rolled out to the rest of the UK because the government said it's stall out by using taxpayers' money for the infrastructure, getting the motor manufacturers to pump more vehicles into the system, which then brings the price down via the zero-emission vehicle mandate. That's the sort of proposed method.
We've got a question here around charge point reliability. Another anonymous person asks, why has the government not taken a more active role in the implementation of charging infrastructure, and how do we improve charging network reliability? Graham, I'll go to you, and then Annalisa, I'd also like to come to you after Graham, just to talk around charge point reliability. Is there anything that California does in particular to address this? Graham?
Yeah, I think this is a key issue because anyone I speak to who's got an electric car, who's been on any kind of journey, that they seem to be incredibly stressed out in trying to find charging points that actually work. And I do have figures on this. We looked at how many charging points have had faults in Scotland so far this year, and if you compare the number that had faults with the number that actually exist, it's 60%. So that's really high. So if you've got, I can understand why people get stressed. I was speaking to someone the other day who's just bought an electric vehicle near to where I live, and they were saying, well, do you know where there's that charge point just down the road? You can only get it to work if you stick twigs in it, so that it will actually connect. Now, I'm not sure how you actually find this out. Probably have to go on some obscure forum to discover how this thing can actually work. Well, that's not acceptable, and that kind of performance is what puts people off buying these vehicles.
Annalisa?
Once again, we have very similar experiences. California is struggling with the reliability of charging stations. Though when I talk to electric vehicle supply providers, they claim 98% uptime on their network or better. And could you tell us specifically which charger? We'll go check it out. But every driver that I talk to has a story of a journey that they made where there was an issue. My own is a very quick trip down to Los Angeles from Northern California. I mapped out every charger I was going to stop at on my 400-mile journey, and I had backups, and I ended up using all of the backups because my first choice didn't work. It either couldn't take the payment, was dead on arrival, or failed after getting the payment to work to actually initiate a charge. So we definitely have an issue, and I'm working with the infrastructure providers to try and figure out what is the issue. Is it lack of network connectivity, because all of these chargers are cellular devices effectively? Is it hardware reliability, or is it user error? What is the issue? And then try to figure out what we can do to address that. Is it the case that the state, which is putting a lot of money into public charging, needs to also require maintenance plans that have a specified performance criteria, that chargers, once reported inoperative, will be fixed within 24 or 48 hours or something like that? We do have a crowdsourced network status system with PlugShare, which is incredibly useful, that drivers can report where a charger is not working, and other drivers there can see if the charger they plan to use has been used successfully recently. So that's helpful, but that's not a solution. That's not a systemic solution which gives confidence to drivers, and they absolutely need that. When was the last time you worried about whether the petrol station you were going to drive up to was going to be working?
Quite recently.
Okay, well, haven't encountered that for a while, in the U.S. anyway. But these are the kinds of things that consumers need to have confidence in. So we are definitely focused on trying to figure out how to address that, either through our subsidy programs, making sure that maintenance plans are included, or through a more systemic look at what the causes are and what we might be able to do to help the industry sort it out.
Thank you, Annalisa. Hugh, I know that you want to come in, and then Andy, I'll go.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think the question is often posed, why doesn't the government do? But, I mean, I went to a conference recently, the question was turned the other way, which is, why does the government get involved in this? Why doesn't the market deal with this? Is this a transaction between a consumer and a private company? I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. So what the government tries to do, because my answer back there was actually there is no market, so the government has to get involved in creating a market, like we did with solar, but then we exit it. But the big challenge for the government in terms of where to put the money, and you look at the 1.3 billion charge infrastructure fund, 950 million of that is going on motorways and the strategic network. Now you could argue that's where the market could actually deliver, because there should be the take-up. Is the government money better in the sort of rural not spots? Otherwise we're going to end up like a broadband mobile situation. But I would just turn it back, as a Conservative, I believe in this, that the government should get involved where it needs to create a market and just create that sort of spark. But then the government should get out, because it should be left to private enterprise and not the government crowding it out, and as it often does, getting things wrong.
Patrick, can I just give you
Sure, I think, Andy, I'll go to you first because you want to speak and then I'll go to you.
I think as we explore rollout to electric vehicles, there's a big difference between being a potential buyer and being an owner. What you'll tend to find is as you become an owner of an electric car is that you actually don't use fast charging very often. Something like 90% of all charging is done at home. So the question that was raised earlier about how do you deal with curbside charging is probably the most relevant point here. And home chargers, probably because they use much lower voltages, are much more reliable. So you rarely have a problem with a home charger. On the destination chargers, the fast chargers, they have been unreliable. Part of the problem in the UK has been that there was a monopoly on the service station charging. That's been solved now, I believe. But I don't think government needs to be involved in that, to be frank. I think, as you said, that's a transaction between the consumer and the charging provider, and if you don't like your charging provider, then basically find another one eventually. One thing I would say that government could potentially be involved in is the plug. At the moment we have 3 standards of plug in the UK. Isn't that nuts, given the shortage of chargers? Mm-hmm. We homologate just about everything on a motor vehicle today. We define exactly how it should be constructed, and for some reason we don't do that on plugs. There is utterly nothing to stop the UK government through its homologation bodies saying we will have only one fast charging plug. And you know what? That's going to open up the charging infrastructure 3 times over. So I would concentrate government efforts on that to have a homologation standard for a plug.
Thank you, Andy.
No, and just to add and pick up from Hugh, I think we've just realised it's not just about money, is it? You know, the role of government.
Yeah.
Like you said, you don't want to spend government for money in the wrong places. But as we're embarking on a big infrastructure strategy, we really need to now make way and pick up these points about minimum standards. You know, consumer reliability, the experience piece is really important in addition to adequacy. So there's a lot that government can do to make the consumer experience so appealing, like we discussed early on, that they actually think not even twice about it going forward. I think in terms of regulation, there's definitely more that can be done as well around building regs. These are not new ideas, these are out there, so I don't think this is particularly challenging going forward. And then really you can focus your enabling support on the bits that you just highlighted, Hugh, where there is a market failure, and think about learning from examples in America about how do you make business models work by combining the obligations on you get access to that thing that works for you by also picking up the areas that might not be so profitable or enabling. So I do think there's a lot of innovation happening across, and I think one of the good things about here is we can exchange those ideas, and I think there's more we can do in that space.
Thank you, Constance. I know there was a question here. The roaming mic will just come to you.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I work for an engineering firm, but on the side, I also volunteer at a wind farm and a solar park. So my question is linked to renewables. Obviously, EV isn't green unless the fuel is green. Is there a role for the motor industry to invest, to partner with renewables, to lobby the government against new coal mines, oil and gas plants? Is there a role to link that so that it also can trickle down to the consumer, that thing of my car is charged by that turbine there, by this wind farm there?
Constance, I might go to you.
I mean, I think this is probably also not really new, because you know, for car companies in terms of the production, they're already having to find a way of making the production, as we talked earlier on, as clean as possible. So already the use of renewables, the lobbying of government to make investment in these really much more zero emission type of energy sources and technologies in the production of the vehicle, that's already happening. I think when it comes to the electricity that needs to go into these vehicles we are talking about, you're absolutely right. And I think the government has just recently announced its own ambition in that space around 2035. It makes total sense for anybody wanting to buy an electric vehicle that they need to trust that actually the electricity that goes into the vehicle is as green or as zero as possible. And I think that's been a major step that's been announced. Now we need to see delivery on this one. So I mean, I wouldn't answer your point whether we should lobby, invest. Individual manufacturers choose their own way and they collaborate already. But I think in terms of the underlying question that you have, absolutely, the energy that goes in it needs to be zero. So we need to look at all the sources that can provide that for the grid.
There's quite a sure, Annalisa.
I'll try to make it quick. In California, we have what's called the low carbon fuel standard. So we're actually using the electricity that is used for transportation that generates low carbon fuel standard credits, which are sold to the petrol companies because they need to offset their carbon emissions and the carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel. And the sale of those credits goes back to new car buyers of zero emission vehicles. So we have that cycle that's encouraging electric vehicle purchase that's being paid for by the the petroleum companies. It's a pretty nice cycle.
Andy.
I mean, each company will decide how it wants to deal with this. In the case of Switch, we make the decision up front that we're going to be net zero from the get-go. So we essentially buy green electricity. Interestingly, even though I applaud the government with its zebra policy for buses, it attributes no value between net zero and zero emission. So if you've got a battery electric bus, you get the incentive without questioning whether it's net zero. And we've talked about the difference between the two. So I think perhaps in public procurement, there is a role for government to demand that basically what they're using is net zero, not just zero emissions. The other point that I would make on behalf of the car industry is remember that all of EVs that are made today basically lose money. So there isn't a great big purse of cash for the car industry to be putting into all of this. Basically, when I introduced Leaf to the market, it wasn't only loss making; it didn't even cover the cost of goods sold. So it didn't even cover the material cost, let alone all of the overheads. So that will evolve in time as basically costs come down. But as you transition to any new industry, there's a cost up front associated with it, and that the way that you incentivate that determines the choices that you're made. And I would appeal to anybody in the bus industry to procure, for example, based upon net zero carbon, not simply on zero emissions.
Thank you, Andy. Got quite a few comments and questions from our virtual audience around charge point rollout, some reflections of disappointment towards local councils rolling out charge points, which you touched on in your remarks, Hugh.
Yep, sure.
I think what I'll do is just ask this question here because it encapsulates all of the other questions. And it says, from an anonymous person, subsidising for DNO/businesses, is that needed, as some businesses are looking at well over £100,000 to get the required electricity supply for charges at their premises? Do you think, Hugh? Do you think there is? Sorry. Do you think is there a case for more government support for businesses to roll out charge points?
No, I think the government is currently putting a lot of taxpayers' money into it, and so I mean I've said this already actually, so it's probably fairer for others to say that. I think we've got the balance about right.
Okay. Cool.
Sorry, short but sweet.
No, that's what we like. Some more online questions here. So another one for you, Hugh, asking if road costs are funded by road pricing, will the council tax element for highways be scrapped?
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, look, let's not get into reform of social care and council tax. Otherwise, we can be here for the whole day. I'm really passionate about that as well. So, yeah, I think this is a really interesting one because part of the arguments for road tax. In terms of road pricing, I should say, is that really it will give a lot more clarity as to how much when you go to the petrol diesel station and fill up actually goes to the tax payer in general. So what's it, about 60p if the price around 120 goes to the tax, and none of that goes on the roads because what the government have done is they used to have sort of hypothecated both fuel duty and indeed vehicle excise duty. What's happened is the vehicle excise duty is almost political. The government says actually that is hypothecated just because the figures are about right. So you've got a huge amount of tax that goes in. The motorist is actually paying in order to subsidise sort of non-roads. So the question, is that right? So one of the things we could do if we actually look at road pricing is also actually make it more transparent so that the motorists, that money then goes into the roads. And I think that would actually help the petrol heads argument, because there's obviously resistance to road pricing, but people don't realise they're actually paying not just for the roads but a lot more thereafter because of the excess amounts that are raised. But then what that then means is that we're going to have to find other ways to increase taxes in the general sense to cover the fuel duty part to it. So it's quite complicated. But I do see, what I love about this is using price as a lever to really influence change. And I really believe that if people saw the true value of road pricing, when someone gave us an estimate when we asked them in the evidence session of 10p a mile, just sort of throw it out there, but you would price differently depending on the wear and tear that your vehicle actually puts on the roads. That's absolutely right. The time you actually use the roads in order to reduce congestion and make air pollution less. I think this could really change the game and put more people onto public transport. So I shouldn't really be biased because I haven't written the report yet, but you've got a pretty good idea as to where I'd be recommending. And I do feel that the government is interested in this take, because this target is going to have to deliver this. Whereas before, when it's been brought in, it's just been hammered by the Daily Mail as being toll charges, etc. Now it's a question of, well, something's got to pay for the roads because this is all going to come to an end. So this gives us the opportunity to really change the game and then change behaviour.
Thank you, Hugh. I just want to squeeze in one more question. I'm just conscious of time. Ian, there is a question for you around behavioural policy, and you talked about that in your opening statement. Do you want to see anything more from government around nudging people towards EVs? This is from one of our virtual viewers.
Nudging is probably the right word. I think we've touched on it several times. There's a definite need for a stick and a carrot, in our opinion. We need, I think Constance touched on it very eloquently earlier, we need both. I think if you look at consumer behaviours in the context of the fuel crisis, for example, recently we saw a huge spike of interest for EVs on our platform. A bit like if it snowed tomorrow, you'd have a lot of people flooding into the market to sell their rear-wheel drive cars because they can't sort of navigate the road so carefully. When you couldn't fuel your petrol or diesel car, you looked at, well, maybe I should accelerate my journey towards electric. So a big spike of interest, and that's encouraging. That's been continued since that period. But what that also shows is the behavioural issues that we see of people who have these myths I touched on earlier about what EVs are all about. I think Andy talked about it. You don't drive home with your petrol or diesel car every day and refuel it before you put it in the garage or park it on the road. But you have this impression when you're buying an EV that that's what you need to do. Now, the vast majority of people do it. The average UK, I think, is a 20-mile daily drive. The average journey is an 8-mile journey. So the vast majority of the time, you do not need to charge your electric vehicle. You do on the fast, you do need fast charging on major highways and so on. Democratization of EVs is what we talked about. They need to be more affordable. They need to be more convenient. If we can attack both of those, we will affect change from a behavioural point of view. And I think that's where we also need to encourage the industry to make the change. We've just briefly, we've launched today in partnership with the industry a toolkit, if you like, for carbon literacy training, which is something we've designed together with the Carbon Literacy Trust, work across all sorts of other sectors, with government particularly as well, and in partnership with the likes of Marshalls, Lookers, Nissan, Motorpoint, right across the industry, we put in place a toolkit which allows industry partners to basically train their own people in understanding their own personal and collective business impact on the environment. And the more we as an industry can understand the role we have to play, then I think the more likely we are also to encourage that behavioural change, to come back to your point, that is so important.
Thank you, Ian. I am conscious of time. We are just over 1:30, so I will bring things to a close now. We could probably sit here for another hour and keep talking. There's plenty to discuss, but thank you very much to our panellists for coming along today and sharing with us your insights. It's been a really interesting discussion. And for our audience, do feel free to go out into the foyer there, help yourself to tea and coffee, carry on the conversation if you wish, and we will be having our next event in this space in half an hour's time. So thank you very much, everyone.